After a long, multi-year drought of Advance Wars-like turn-based strategy titles, all of a sudden it feels like we're getting a flood now. But the latest to come out might be one of the most aesthetically appealing yet, because this one's got mechs in it. Warborn takes all that Advance Wars goodness and dunks it in a coat of Gundam paint. You've got experimental super mechs with some strikingly familiar designs, a whole conflict between a planet and its associated space colonies, and even scientifically created super soldiers that echo new types. But Warborn is more than just another Advance Wars-like with a can of mecha paint slapped on. It heavily emphasizes different parts of the strategy subgenre's core formula, building a game that's far more about the micro-strategy of individual units than the macro long view of an entire battlefront. And we're going to be spending this review diving deep into all those little nitty-gritty details that set Warborn apart. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're outmaneuvering our opponents in mechs in Warborn. Before we get too deep into this review, I did receive a free advance review copy of this game, so heads up. Warborn's flashiest change to the Advance Wars formula is hero units. Though Wargroove from last year also went the same direction, Warborn's hero units take the idea to its ultimate extreme. In the campaign where you usually have access to them, hero units are capable of holding down an entire flank on their own. They're offensive powerhouses, but the more you play, the more you realize that these units are in fact quite mortal, and even average units can achieve the same devastating results if you use them right. In fact, every unit in this game is effective throughout the entire match from start to finish. Unlike the games the subgenre was founded on, which have linear progressions from light tanks to medium to heavy and so on, units in Warborn all feel more like side grades. While more expensive units do have more firepower, even a bottom-of-the-barrel unit has teeth to it. And with a solid buff or two, even those lowly scouts can team up and devastate anything in front of them. But you'll have to choose what you build carefully, because you're only going to be able to make a few units before the match is decided. Economies in this game are positively anemic, and you'll only ever make enough to summon one new unit per turn. For many of the more expensive units, you'll even have to save up, so it's incredibly rare to ever have more than 8 units on the field at once, no matter how big or complicated a map you're playing on, which means Warborn feels like it has a reduced scope compared to similar titles. And I have mixed feelings about that. On the positive side, every single unit is valuable, and nothing feels better than combining the specialized talents of 3 different units to annihilate an enemy commander in a single blow. But this does come at the cost of the economic side of the game, which has always been a driving force of much of the strategy in the genre. Instead of battling for territory to build an overwhelming military complex your opponent can't stand up to, victory in Warborn is entirely focused on the moment-to-moment strategy and making smart trades to the neglect of anything else. In addition, the game is also missing elements like sea, air, or transport units, and while artillery does exist, its role is significantly reduced, all of which prunes the game of entire layers of strategic depth. It also tends to make matches a little more snowbally. Since economies are so small and every unit can be effective, blowing up an opponent's first few scouts without losing your own gives you a strong starting advantage, and as you keep building units and blowing up your opponents, the gap only widens until the map looks like this. So what does Warborn do to make up for all of this? In addition to the aforementioned system of buffs and debuffs which can provide additional depth by making even the weakest mech a legitimate threat, Warborn's heightened focus on individual units means that each one has a far wider range of abilities than you'd expect from something in this genre, which keeps that moment-to-moment combat compelling. And while Warborn may have fewer units than its contemporaries, I also feel like it has more potential strategies based on which ones you pick. Other Advance Wars-like titles demand that you go with a combined arms approach and build everything every time, but Warborn's more limited economy guarantees that you'll have to pick and choose what you build based on the map and what you're fighting. So while the game loses depth in some areas, it also gains a lot of breadth and depth of strategy in the tactical department. So overall, I think all of these little changes are fine. The focus on individual, more complicated units and a smaller economy aren't quite enough to divorce Warborn from its peers, but are enough to give it a distinct feel. A lot of what I've talked about feels like splitting hairs a bit, but those little details are what set this game apart from its contemporaries, and they establish a pretty solid foundation. But unfortunately, there's not much built on top of that foundation. Warborn has 3 modes: multiplayer, offline skirmish versus AI, and a campaign. And as is usually the case with these little indie games, there just flat out isn't anyone to play with in multiplayer, meaning you will only ever fight against this game's AI. And Warborn's AI is sorely lacking as an opponent. Playing in skirmish mode, you'll start noticing these deficiencies pretty quickly. About the only thing the AI knows how to do is build whatever it can afford on a given turn, then throw those units at you in waves of 1s and 2s. Every once in a while, they can catch you with a big AoE attack if you group up, but for the most part, Warborn's AI just lemmings into you in meat grinder tactics, and the game's systems just require a more nuanced approach than that. Warborn introduces a lot of complicated and interesting units that all interlock with each other, but the AI can't really keep up with those additional complexities, and honestly, creating one that could would be an astonishing achievement. This is a game that truly calls for an actual thinking opponent, and there's just not one to find. Even in campaign, where the developers could build handcrafted levels that put the player on an uneven playing field to make up for the AI, things are a little lackluster. Curiously, the game seems to insist on going the opposite direction and weighting scenarios in favor of the player. Most missions, the game will give the player an entire army of 7 mechs, then pit them against disconnected pockets of enemies that never coordinate and are always easily wiped out. I finished numerous levels without even losing a single unit. One level I even completed without calling a single reinforcement. Even at the halfway point, Warborn's campaign isn't just easy, it's effortless to the point that it practically rolls over for the player. And as the primary way most people experience this game, it leaves a little to be desired. There are a few hints that the game will continue to get more complex and might start trying to put up an actual challenge, because the second campaign is a noticeable spike in difficulty from the first, but 5 hours is a long time to go before I start feeling some level of engagement. In a similar vein, the narrative has also managed to get halfway through with only the barest hint of what its central conflict is. The narrative is more interested in finding excuses to introduce the game's full roster of units, which is fine as a design choice, and it does perfectly well, but 5 hours in, there's not much actual narrative to get invested in. Which neatly brings us to the big question: what do you get out of 5 hours with Warborn? Of the 5 hours I played, I spent an hour in skirmish and 4 in campaign, which was enough to get me almost halfway through, but a lot of that time felt like it was spent waiting to get to the good bits, and 5 hours is a long time to wait for that. Ultimately, whether you'll enjoy Warborn or not entirely depends on how badly you're looking for another entry in this genre. It's an especially tough recommendation if your time's at a premium, because it doesn't quite do enough in its opening hours to make sticking around seem appetizing. But that's not to say that I didn't have any fun with it. There are a lot of interesting ideas under the hood here, and just the act of learning how they all interlock and how to use them was inherently enjoyable. But like many of its units, the game feels like a side grade to many already existing titles rather than a step forward. Which means that overall, Warborn is a perfectly worthy game if it's your jam, but not a must-play by any means. Hey, if you guys didn't already know, I just launched a Patreon, and with your generous support, I can start doing all kinds of cool stuff, like more in-depth video essays and 5-hour streams where I review games like this in real time. So if any of that sounds cool, please consider becoming a patron today. But I hope you enjoyed this first 5 review. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.